Okay, I'm still sat here with Robert Jackson, and we've been talking about video games and philosophy. And part of the reason we've talked about that is you've written about this one video game, one of the few video games I've played in the last decade or so, other than important ones like Tetris, which is BioShock. So why did you, as someone interested in philosophy and these kind of questions, why did you want to write about BioShock in terms of generally about video games, but why BioShock also in particular?
One reason is I wanted to see if I could actually write a book on it. Because that's one of the things that when you ask this question, it's usual "who cares" question. Yeah, it's like so what? Who cares? Yeah.
Blog about it, but a book.
Yeah. One of the things is I wanted to see if I actually could write about it and see if I was up to the task. The second thing is
that.
We'll see. But the second option is that BioShock as a video game is, if you ask most video game players to kind of talk about an important video game that has mature content and is interesting, BioShock will kind of be up there. It was released in 2007. It's arguably one of the first commercial games that was commercially successful, that dealt with mature themes and actually, whether people agree that it actually did it successfully or whatever, but it did.
And was certainly a real attempt to engage with those themes.
Those themes, exactly, through a certain fixed narrative that people would argue are not necessarily indicative of games for other reasons, but nonetheless, it's a game which put a certain mature allegory on the map. As a certain way. You can see the distance between the two, because 2007, the original BioShock, and then there was a sequel, I think 2010, and then BioShock Infinite, 2013. From that point to that point, and the guy called Phelan Parker, who's wrote about this elsewhere, said actually the gap between then and between back then and now, if you think about all the way that video game culture has kind of sort of developed into a complex ways, you kind of had unadulterated kind of praise for BioShock as this fantastic game that dealt with mature ideas, to BioShock Infinite, which kind of did the same thing. It's kind of the same game, but then you had this whole kind of more complex blog culture around it that kind of dissected the game to bits for not being...
No, I was amazed when I did some research, when I was talking to you, just how the kind of sheer weight of content really taking apart the real nuts and bolts of the kind of way the narrative worked, and all that side of it.
Exactly, and BioShock was known as one of the best games of its generation of that decade. To go from that to BioShock Infinite, where there's much more focus on itself as a mature game, there's far more games that have come from that original game that have dealt with certain mature things in a certain allegorizing way. To go from that to that is quite. You can see the shift.
It's quite indicative. It's quite a kind of case study of how the entire culture and the willingness of people to offer critique.
Exactly.
Kind of movement. So I can understand why that might draw you to BioShock as a game. So when you came to look at it in some detail and to write something that was longer than a 2-page blog post, what kind of approach did you end up taking to BioShock, and how did that kind of lead you through?
Well, the actual franchise, the way it works is this idea that you're a man. You stumble upon this lost, withdrawn world that you're forced to go into and deal with. In BioShock's case, it's this place called Rapture, which is loosely based on Ayn Rand. This idea of what would Ayn Rand find as a utopia, something like Rapture, complete free market economics. You can do whatever you want, free market reigns. And BioShock Infinite, then it's taken to a sort of theological Christian stance, which is much more based.
You're in the clouds.
You're in the clouds. And it's far more based on a sort of theocratic. Theocratic kind of reign of keeping purity, keeping vigilance.
That runs right through Infinite, I think.
Exactly.
One thing I did playing it.
But one of the things that I identified with the game quite early on, and this is a major intervention of the book, is this idea of kind of disputing the notion that both games have a kind of truth, of that allegorical truth to them. Now, both games are more or less exactly the same, actually.
Right.
They have the same sort of systems, they have the same sort of histories, the way they came together. BioShock has an incredible history of basically converging two types of game genres together, and not very successfully. The first-person shooter and the role-playing game, and really it's a kind of ecology of trying to make those fuse together into a commercial title that was trying to compete with Halo, trying to compete with Half-Life, and Quake, all of these games around about the time that it was around. And from that, it's really a case of, well, at what point, when you get to that level of analysis, the allegory, in a sense, kind of breaks down. This is the Latourian side that I was talking about in an earlier video, is that allegory is, in a sense, not really. It's not like it shouldn't be taken seriously, but it's one side of a deeper ecological form of control that I think is an undercurrent of the system that BioShock is made from. And this is where I think that not the truth of the game, but nonetheless the major sort of, I say sort of metaphor, but metaphor made literal, is this idea of propaganda. That is a major focus of both games. Is the idea of you're exploring an environment that is in a sense a sort of propaganda that is meant to, and you're kind of analysing sort of disinformation. Of it, both in Rapture in the first game and Columbia in BioShock Infinite, and it's really a case of, okay, well, what if we took that propaganda and kind of extrapolated it into it being a general system of how public opinion is constructed. Not in a totalitarian. And the last chapter of it is about this notion of trying to reclaim that word, because I think it's not a word you hear unless it's used very much in the extreme of ISIS.
Propaganda is what other people do. Your enemy
it's what
uses
other
propaganda.
countries. Yeah, exactly. It's what North Korea does. It's not Western societies. But no, there's a whole literature of people who study propaganda. The 20th century is the age of is a century of propaganda since the Great War. If you look at the history of it, and I know BioShock's not talking about that history. Nonetheless, you have to analyse it as a system that is part of that history. So it's not something you can just you can just play it and go, oh, well, that's the good truth about, Ant-Man was bad.
So you can kind of pull it out and look at it kind of in isolation and say, oh, look, Christian Science bad, Ant-Man bad. They all use propaganda and we didn't realise now played the game. And I do realise I've had a kind of a liberal awakening.
Exactly, but that's the thing. That's the major focus of the book, is this idea of, well, okay, what is it as a system in a sort of Western democracy? How is that system being used by the developers? How has it come about? How's the history of that come about? And there's a wonderful essay by this guy called Jonas Stahl, who looks at the idea of propaganda from the World's Fair. World's Fair goes back to middle of the 19th century. And this notion of, he says, that's the first moment when you had this notion of democratist propaganda, this idea of a show that's a complete bubble, that it's its own logic, that propagates Western democracy. In a very...
And you get all these nations come along and they pretend to be like Western democracy in order to sell to them in this kind of trade myth.
Exactly. And that's how... And interesting, that's kind of how BioShock Infinite works, because it has this whole propaganda... One of the levels is this notion of a propaganda... the Wounded Knee historical event is woven into the narrative, and this propaganda thing that you have to fight through, that you're being subjected. And BioShock follows this whole franchise follows this notion of inspecting other nations, inspecting other values, and comparing and contrasting them with your own. And that's essentially how World's Fair works. Here's some Indians, or here's some colonial, and that's the point at where the differences between certain tribes, certain civilizations are compared in this massive system. That then promotes a certain number of values with that, and then, but it's also, he goes on, he says, it's the first time that corporate companies got in and sponsored, and it's the first time that sort of democracy was aligned with, sort of capitalist infrastructure.
And that's the way that these nations are going to enter into on an equal footing this thing, and it's going to save them, and we're going to be changing anything either. It's more kind of almost like those magazines you read on planes or airports that have adverts of trading in different countries. It's that kind of mythic notion of them all as different and yet...
exactly. And the World's Fair was brilliant at doing that. And you can see contemporary versions of TED Talks or Freeze Art Fairs. It's that notion of all-encompassing, but nonetheless, what must not be acknowledged is the marketplace behind.
Is the ultimate part of...
And that's how I think BioShock Infinite should be looked at, as how it propagates those sorts of values rather than something which is allegorising values. Or perhaps the allegory is the other side of it. The propaganda has an allegory built into it.
Which is quite interesting, because one of the terms you use in the title is forced choice. I just wonder if you could speak about that phrase. So I find that very kind of...
Yeah, one of the things I start with the book is this notion of, isn't it the most paradoxical thing to say it was my only choice?
Right.
When you look at something, you think, well, that's not really a choice.
It was the only choice I had was to do X, yeah.
Exactly. Video games arguably are kind of exemplars of this. They are, whether it's different types of video games, whether it's a sandbox genre in which you can kind of combine different bits and do.
But if you go back to those old text-based,
exactly.
Ancient, you can approach a door, open or shut, east
Exactly.
or west.
Well, that's the definition of play, really. Is this notion of freedom in certain fixed
context,
rules, in context of rules,
Yeah.
and that's essentially what I'm saying with forced choice. But that in a sense you're guided in a certain way towards a certain effective conclusion. That nonetheless, the choices you have are nonetheless decided by the system. In a way that leads it to a certain effectivity that is indicative of the system itself. And that's the other side of the forced choices, I think I call it decision. And there's a whole history of that with computation, this idea of computational decision. But nonetheless, it's this idea that the system has been built to decide a certain outcome that is for the benefit of the constructor. And that's in it. You can apply that to anything. It's not just video games. You can apply it to a leisure centre because how do I determine the price of how do I get a gym contract? Follow this, and this, and there's you can use it the way that, and you could extrapolate that from video games. All sorts of new levels of control, like gamification.
Absolutely.
And
one person designing a gamified learning platform has got the outcome is that you will learn Spanish or whatever.
Exactly, but that's how computation works.
But it will flowchart you down various ways of choices. But the result of your choices will always be, unless you get it wrong, let's start again.
Or the alternatives are so fundamentally impossible and untoward that you might as well not bother. And I think that's part of living in a technological society where technology has become more proliferated in our daily lives. Of things like mobile phones and how particularly internet structures, protocols have been used by companies to offer things like free services. There are certain fixed things you have to do in order to get access to the freedom of the service. You have to sign up to terms and conditions that take a lifetime to dissect, because otherwise, if you don't, you don't get the system. And
so you can choose between loads of contracts and free things, but the forced choice is you're paying.
Exactly. And I don't want to extrapolate saying like wider culture is a game. No. I don't want to say that, because there's a book by Mackenzie Walk there's a very good book actually called Gamer Theory that says that essentially says aren't video games now the sort of the level playing field of culture at large, which is a bad game in a way. I don't want to say that because I think it's kind of allegorizing it too much. What I want to say is that the way technology works, and this is where the focus of the decision comes in, is that hit computation arguably in some circles is essentially a decisional system. A computation is not effective until it decides something.
Right.
Now, what that decision is, how that decision is up for grabs. But the way, even if it's something as simple as OK and cancel, there's a forced choice there. It's like you can choose whatever you want. You have to choose between OK and cancel, and that's as much to do with how computation exists as a material thing than it is as a cultural application of it. It's what's happened since computation has decided to now how companies view computation to, in a sense, manage society, and essentially that's how BioShock is, because BioShock is very closely aligned to certain technologies in the game. So the first game is genetic technology. The second game is steampunk technology. I'm not saying it's offering us allegories of that, but you flatten everything down. And you look at the themes of it as well as the system itself and the ecology of which it comes through.
So that's interesting. But I'm just wondering whether or not you feel that we're going to see more of that in new games, or new games that come out recently. You start to note that within them as a kind of...
it's definitely the case that game designers, indie game designers have taken advantage of those. I'm not explicitly sort of. I guess I'm not authoritatively someone who's an expert in this, but certainly the transgender games development community are fantastic at realising this, because they realise that games are in a sense systems which are kind of a hindrance. They offer forced choices, and they want to map those forced choices with the forced choices of being a transgender person, and what kind of difficulties they face by daily challenges.
And so building that into a game allows a kind of, not quite a naturalisation, but a kind of reality to emerge from that, in the way that it emerges unspoken and acknowledged from other kinds of games.
Exactly, and certainly they've been used as learning tools to do that. But as I say, I think my intervention is kind of grounded in this notion of, well, it's not allegorising it; it's in a sense propagating certain very good values. And that's the thing. I don't want to say propaganda is innately bad.
No,
it's just how society runs. Whether it's a hermit society, whether it's a totalitarian, whether it's a Western democratist society, it's something that is used to structure public opinion. How that public opinion is structured is part of. But
the less we realise that that's what's going on, the less we've got an opportunity to get involved and structure it in ways that we think are benign, progressive, whatever our views might be.
Exactly, and that's why systems like Twine, for example, which are open source, the fact that it's open source in a sense propagates its own openness.
Yeah, so there's value deep in the very nature of that from the outset.
Exactly, and all values. It's a question of what values are up for grabs that we can propagate. Well, because the left are terrible at propaganda. Let's say right now.
Embarrassed and shamed of having to do it. Yeah.
Why on earth are the left so focused on truth?
Yeah.
I understand why, but that's another part of the book. Is, well, why? Why do we? There's the fantastic theorist George Lakoff, who has been saying this for years, and actually Ian Bogost, one of the more sort of well-known video game theorists, is very much of this opinion. Is this idea of, well, the left are absolutely terrible at being reactive. If everything's gone further and further reactionary, the left have been terrible at. All the left have done is they've just simply told truths about what's going on, and kind of said, well, this is bad, and
as if kind of self-evidentness of them being right,
like reason will win out. Like the truth will win out, and it isn't. So if that's the case, Lakoff has said quite clearly. He said, well, no, what the left should do is they should not propagate, but they should get back into manipulating,
myth making,
because otherwise, this is what the right knows so well. They know that they're not necessarily.
And then myth making about all sorts of issues, be it migration, be it kind of
free market
benefits, or whatever it might be. Myth work. People like myths.
People love myths.
It kind of penetrates them at a deeper level than comparing statistics on charts.
Yeah.
And everyone's already suspicious of that.
Well, like I said, there's that Stanley Cavell quote that I absolutely love, which is the idea that a myth is just something. It's just an event that happened that no one was present for.
Yeah.
And that's how it works.
And no one really minds about that.
Yeah.
Because the myth's got some narrative. And so it catches us. Well,
like games, all ideologies require a narrative, and the left are just terrible at propaganda. They need to be better at sort of propagating their values, and in a sense, a certain type of manipulation. Not manipulation is bad. But, why? It's just, if that's how society runs, that's why the left's losing. So it seems like a no-brainer to me. We've tried everything else.
Yeah.
So.
On that optimistic conclusion.
Yeah.
Thank you, Rob.